The title, the first part of the title, Only West Indians, you'll find in the epigraph to the book. It comes from a speech given by Dr. Eric Williams in 1955. And if you don't mind, I'd like to read you that passage so you can see exactly where it comes from. Man in the West Indies is more than white, more than mulatto, more than Negro, more than Indian, more than Chinese. He is West Indian. West Indian by birth, West Indian in customs, West Indian in dialect or language, West Indian finally in aspirations. Our democratic development, like Mateo's revolution in Cuba, has no color. It has no little Negroes, no little whites, no little Indians, no little Chinese. It has only West Indians. Now, when I came across that passage, I knew I had my title, because that summarized for me in a very short compass the nature of what Williams and the other Creole nationalists were talking about. This was what they wanted to construct. This was the kind of nation that they wanted to build, one that was beyond race, but that was democratic and egalitarian. So that was where my title comes from, this idea of a democratic, egalitarian, multiracial, multicultural nation. And for me that summarized what Creole nationalism in the British West Indies was about. That's where I got my title.
Thank you, Dr. Ledgister. During the last faculty author publications that we did here last year, I was looking on the internet, and I plugged in your name onto Google, and I saw many publications by you. 2010, the year before, and the year before. There is an idea for a book in my head, but I don't know how to get that idea out on the paper, to make a book. And I'm sure there are many people out there like me. What advice do you have for people like me? I have the ideas in my head for a book, but I don't know how to sit down and put that idea in the form of a book. Is it I'm too lazy, or I don't have the time? I don't know what is going on. Do you have ideas for someone like myself?
Well, as a friend of mine who is a professional writer says, the first thing you do is you sit down in front of the keyboard and you start writing. That's the first thing. What you start writing is just a few sentences. You have an idea, okay, so what's your idea? Write it down. Then you say, okay, how do I turn this into something a bit more thorough? Where am I going to go with this particular idea? Now, when I began work on Only West Indians, my first thought was, okay, here's this issue of Creole nationalism. Where does it come from? And initially, I started with Dr. Eric Williams. I said, okay, there's Williams, but where did Williams come from? And my thought said, okay, we'll sit down and write this down. Where did Williams come from? I said, okay, Williams was taught by James. And I thought at first that was a dead end. And I wrote down a few words and I thought, okay, there's James's self-government in the West Indies. That was before all his major work as a Trotskyist. Let me go and read that. So I jotted a note about that, and I went and read it, and I said, so James leads to Williams. What leads to James? And I went and reread, because I first read it in high school, Fruitacity by J.J. Thomas. And I said, I don't have enough yet. And I went back and I reread the speeches and writings of Norman Manley, so I had the basic structure. And then I went back to look at some of my earlier work on Carlyle and Mill, and I had most of it. Then I went and said, okay, what's missing, I put down, I went and read Trollope and Kingsley. Now sometimes you have some serendipity. It happens I came across an article on Kingsley and Kingsley's At Last, which was his record of a visit to Trinidad in 1869, and that helped fill out the precursors to Thomas. Thomas filled out that chapter. I was able to turn to James, and I was able after James to look at Norman Manley, who was my bridge to Williams. And then once I'd done that, I was able to write my introduction and then write my conclusion. Because I have a structure worked out. You always write your introduction second to last.
This is August. We still have 5 months or 4 months before the end of the year. Do you have anything in the press? That's question number one. Then number two, what projects are you working right now that may lead to a book, maybe next year or the year after?
Well, I don't have anything major in press right now. I've got a couple of book reviews that are coming out in the Caribbean Review of Books, which will be available online in the next month or two. And you can look for them on the CRB website.
I will check. I will go there and check.
I do have a project that I have been working on over the past year, which is to look at what I'm calling post-Creole democracy, specifically in Jamaica. What I've worked on so far is looking at Michael Manley, the son of Norman Manley, and his initial political ideas. Michael Manley is known today primarily as an advocate of democratic socialism. He governed Jamaica, was Prime Minister from 1972 to 1980, and again from 1989 to 1992. In the 1970s, he was known as a major socialist leader, as an advocate of the Third World internationally. But what's interesting is when he was first elected in 1972, he wasn't a particular advocate of socialism. He proclaimed his allegiance to democratic socialism in 1974. And what's more interesting is he published a book in 1974, The Politics of Change, a Jamaican Testament. He wasn't the first politician to publish a book while in office, but The Politics of Change is a kind of statement of where he was going, what kind of vision he had as a political leader. Okay, that's interesting. But what's more interesting is when I went back and looked at it, what he didn't say, he didn't use the word socialism, for one thing. That was very interesting. But what it did do was even more interesting. It starts out with two epigraphs. One's from his father, Norman Manley. That you sort of expect. But the other one was from Marcus Garvey. I'm going back and said, okay, that's interesting. Why cite Marcus Garvey? Why? Okay, that was even more interesting. So I look at the book closely, and what I find that's very interesting is his vision for Jamaica and Jamaica's national identity, because he moves Jamaica away from Creole nationalism and reasserts, or asserts more directly, an identity for Jamaica as a black nation with political or social minorities, rather than a multicultural nation that's predominantly black, which was what Creole nationalism was about. Now, that rather challenges what has been the predominant view, which was that the identity of Jamaica as a black nation was not really asserted until the 1990s, and that Manley helped lay the foundation for that in his government in the 1970s, and that Manley's politics in the 70s was more about class than about racial identity, But I'm going back and I'm saying, okay, this is really about reasserting a racial identity as a black nation. And I'm finding that very interesting. Now, what I'm working on right now is about the ideas of one of Manly's ministers, D.K. Duncan, who's still active in Jamaican politics today. We're looking at his ideas in the 1970s. Now, Duncan was something of a firebrand in the 70s, and he's seen as a major political figure of the times, and to some extent he's seen as both someone who was a black nationalist and someone who was a socialist. And what's interesting, what I'm finding as I look at what he said back then, is that class seems to have trumped race in his utterances. And I'm trying right now to see what that means. And I've got something to present in November, and I haven't finished writing about that yet.
Maybe next year or the year after. Dr. Ledgister, I have seen members of faculty from your department, political science department, CAU, and I have seen many graduate students from your department here. So now my question is, during your research for these two publications, did you find the resources that we have here at the Robert Woodruff Library?
Oh, I can give you an unqualified yes to that. I used some of the archival resources here. For example, I read you the epigraph from Only West Indians. I was able to find that quotation from Eric Williams in a collection of Williams's speeches, and that's available in this library in the archives. I was able to use, particularly in the last year or so, my writing the book, a lot of the online resources that the library provides. Those were extremely helpful to me. And I can say that the Woodruff Library was a major resource in putting together the work I did here. It was immensely helpful, and without it I would not have been able to do what I did.
Wow. Thank you. Okay, Dr. Ledgister, do you know we have a new session in the library where we display new books, and most of them are best sellers. So my question to you is, do you have any book that you are reading at the moment?
Well, I'm going to put in a plug for a friend of mine. There's a book that will be coming out in September. It's called Cold Fire. It's a work of fantasy, and the author is Kate Elliott. And the reason I'm putting in a plug is that it's set in an alternative history, in a world that doesn't exist, obviously, and it's set in an alternative Caribbean from the one that exists now. And Ms. Elliott, when she was doing the research for the book, decided she wanted to ask somebody she thought was an expert. Unfortunately, the person she asked was me. So she ended up citing me in the acknowledgements to the book. And so it's coming out in September. And it's a wonderful read, I think it is anyway. And one of the more enjoyable bits of alternative history available, and it's a really enjoyable fantasy novel. And I really like fantasy, and so much of it is written from this perspective of all the characters are white, all the heroic characters are male, and even though the author is a white American, she's written a protagonist who is female, which is fine, but also non-white, and the action takes place in the Caribbean, and most of the characters she writes about are either Native American or black, and I think it's definitely worth reading. I would recommend that.
Dr. Ledgister, you said you like to read fantasies. Do you have like your favorite what will come up on top of your list?
Well, above all of the others, I have to say The Lord of the Rings.
You see the movie?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I've seen all of them.
Thank you,
Thank you very much.
Thank you.